Afternoon, everyone. My name is Will Pomerantz, and I am the director of the Kennan Institute. I want to thank you all for joining us today to hear our speaker discuss his new book, Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy, and analyze the effects of Russia's post-Soviet transformation. Before I begin, I want to encourage everyone to stay up to date on the latest Kennan Institute events and publications by visiting our website and subscribing to our blogs, Focus Ukraine and the Russia File, and our Russian language blog, In Other Words. You can also subscribe to our podcast, Kennan X, and the Russia File. For those of you watching today's presentation who would like to purchase the book, Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy, I'm also pleased to announce that we have a discount code to use. When purchasing the book online, you can use the code at capital AEVV23 to get a 20% discount at checkout on the Rutledge site. For our virtual audience, if you have questions for the speaker, you can submit them via question and answer function on Zoom. Please include your name and affiliation when sending the questions. Next, I want to introduce our speaker. Daniel Satinsky is a consultant and independent researcher. His first business exposure to the Soviet Union began in the 1980s. And then from 1990 to 2014, he participated in numerous joint ventures in telecom and business services. He is the author of the book, Hammer and Silicon, the Soviet Diaspora in the U.S. Innovation Economy, and his current book, Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy through American eyes. We're also going to be joined by Blair, the former director of the Kennan Institute and distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center, who will give some brief remarks following the presentation. But at the present time, Daniel, the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you very much. It's an honor to be able to speak at a Kennan Institute function. I'm very pleased to be able to do this. I want to thank you, and I want to thank Blair for doing all the hard work of pulling this together, and your other staff. And I'm assume that there are some people listening in who are people I interviewed, and I hope maybe they'll speak up a bit as the session goes on. So the elevator speech. This book is about the story of American impact on Russia in the 1980s and 1990s. And it's told through the experiences of the people who lived it, mostly Americans. Now I'm going to switch here to a PowerPoint presentation, which I think you'll probably enjoy seeing more than my lovely face. And once we get it up, let's say, just 1 second. And that looks like it's good. So the question is, why write a book about this period? Well, it's a mostly untold and unrecorded history of Americans and American activity in Russia in the 1980s and the 1990s. It's also a period that I lived through, so it's easier for me to recognize what was going on during that time. Some of the pictures you see here are little highlights of my time in Russia, working in a joint venture and holding our board meeting in Rome. And then the bottom left is in Tomsk in the winter. And on the right is a traditional healer in Yakutsk. My travels took me throughout Russia, and I've drawn on that in order to write this book. I think it's an important era of time that's neglected and underappreciated by Americans in particular, as to the impact that we have had on Russia. I was speaking with one of the people I interviewed for the book the other day, and he said he's writing his own book because he can't get people to sit long enough to listen to his stories. So this book is not my stories, but it is the stories of Americans that I interviewed. I interviewed over 105 of them. I was only able to fit in material from 65 of them, one of them being Blair, who I hope will comment later on. And all these interviews were conducted before the latest Russian invasion of Ukraine. So they focused on the past, and many of the people were still living in Russia at the time I interviewed them. Most of them have all left since then. The focus of the book is on Americans, but Americans weren't the only important influence on Russia in this period. I just didn't have space to include Europeans or Asians who were equally important in shaping institutions there, maybe not equally, but were important in shaping institutions. And I also was found that I could had to focus on certain aspects of that period because it's much too complicated and rich in history to cover it comprehensively. But I want to just point out a couple of the themes of the book that are analytic. As one of the people I interviewed said, you know, while you're doing things, you don't have a big overview. And it's only later that you look back and you can try to figure out, well, what was really going on? And I think that one thing that's important to understand about this period is that Russians and Americans were engaged in common activities, either academic, business, of all sorts, but they often had a different idea about what they were doing. And they didn't always understand each other as to what the other side's objectives were in working together. And I'll give an example of that as we get further along. I also think that as part of that, there was a feeling among Americans that we won the Cold War and that the Russians had to learn to live like we do. I think on the other side, the Russians thought that much less than we did, at least many of them did, and saw that they were engaged in a transformation, a modernization of their country for their own good. So this disparate view of the situation plays itself out. I think it's an important thing to keep in mind as we look at the period and what happened in it. The book begins with talking about citizen diplomacy, because if we look at the history of American-Soviet relations, there are very few exchanges up until the 1980s. There's very little that each side knew about each other. There was that whole academic discipline of Sovietology and figuring out who stood next to whom on top of Lenin's tomb on May Day as a way of trying to understand what was happening in the country, which has really symbolized the lack of contact between the two countries. With the 1980s on the US side, there was a growing concern about nuclear exchange and a possibility of nuclear war, and there was remnants of fairly strong peace organizations in the US, although I would say many people saw them as marginal, but they were relatively strong, and they had the view that we needed to ratchet down the misunderstandings through mutual understanding. A key role in this period was played by the Esalen Institute from California. There was an institute. It's an institute that specializes in the study of human potential, and a whole variety of aspects of human potential. But in any event, the person in the picture on the right corner, Jim Hickman, was studying auras, AURAS, and found, and the Institute understood that the Soviet So we're also interested in auras and had a conference on auras in 1979 in Tbilisi. Hickman went, established some contacts with Soviet scientists, which led to Esalen setting up a Soviet-American exchange program. And that began to grow over the years, including bringing Boris Yeltsin, who's standing here in the grocery aisle, to the US for the first time in 1989. This picture was taken when Yeltsin was on his way to Johnson City Space Center, and he saw a grocery store, Randall's, and said, please pull the car over, I want to go in that grocery store. And he went in the store and walked up and down the aisles, came back and started yelling at this American handler saying, you set this up, you're tricking me, this can't possibly be a regular store. When they convinced him that it did, he then flipped to the other side and said, well, they've been lying to us. And these kinds of exchanges, I think, had a big impact on the Soviet leaders who came to the US in this period of time. Towards the end of this period of citizen diplomacy, there were a number of joint ventures that were set up. The one here at the bottom left is Trenmos Bistro. Trenmos is Trenton, Moscow, came out of the Sister City organization. It was one of the first American-style restaurants in the Soviet Union. Another aspect of citizen diplomacy, which I think is even harder to imagine at this time, were the space bridges that took place that were a direct video exchange between people in the Soviet Union and in the United States. The first one was done at the US Festival, which was bankrolled by Steve Wozniak in 1982. It was a rock and roll festival, and they thought it would be really cool to have some Soviets there, and Hickman arranged for there to be a link in a studio in Moscow. And all of a sudden, the Americans in the stadium were looking at a studio in Moscow with Russian teenagers jumping around with beach balls and rock and roll bands. And Bill Graham, who's a famous rock and roll producer who was producing this, and who's of a Hungarian background, said, this is propaganda, this can't possibly be going on, they're in Washington, D.C., they're not in Moscow. So he pulled the plug on the space bridge. But it was only the beginning, and these space bridges grew throughout the 1980s until the last important series was Peter Jennings on Nightline had members of the Supreme Soviet and of the US Congress exchanging views on political topics of the day. Hard to imagine at this point, but it was the beginnings of these really mass kind of exchanges, particularly with the space bridges. So with the dissolution of the Soviet Union, the US was a strong supporter of Yeltsin, we should say, and there were a number of programs that began to help solidify his political position and to aid the country in this time of transition. There were over 200 different programs that were going on at this time, and the largest was by USAID, and between 1990 and 1994, they spent $3.5 billion supporting programs in Russia and the former Soviet Union, and extended over $10 billion in credits. You'll see in the list of these different programs, private foundations and institutes. So here's where we place the Kennan Institute in Blair's interview in the book. The core and most important of the Yeltsin reforms was privatization. And we don't have time here to talk in detail about privatization, but as long as we understand that, what privatization was to take state property, turn it into private property. That Yeltsin and his team felt that this was critical to prevent the restoration of socialism, that he had to, as quickly as possible, put property in the hands of private people. So the first move in that direction was to allow people to privatize their apartments, to give them a stake in the new market economy. And then began the process of privatizing private business, state businesses. Not all of them, but in this process, the first round, about 15,000 businesses were privatized. In much of the dialogue here in the US, there is an often repeated assertion that Harvard and HIID and Jeffrey Sachs were responsible for, and I wouldn't say hoodwinking or convincing Yeltsin team to introduce shock therapy, and that much of the suffering of the Russian people is attributable to Harvard and to Jeffrey Sachs. I think that this is incorrect. I think it denies and reverses the center of control. It was the Yeltsin team that wanted to privatize, but they didn't know how. They had relationships with Harvard from some of these academic exchanges. They called on Harvard for their assistance. Then later, there was a Credit Suisse team led by Boris Jordan, a third-generation American, Russian-American, who transformed Harvard's initial voucher program into one that it eventually was implemented. And Jordan went to the Russian Privatization Agency and said they would do it for nothing. And it's a very interesting process, and his interview in particular in my book, I think, will be interesting for those who are interested about this process itself and the role of Americans in implementing the reforms that Russian elite who were running the country at the time wanted but didn't know how to do. As the aid programs developed and international corporations began to explore Russia as a market, that more and more foreigners came into Russia. I'm going to focus only on Russia here. And there was a growing community. It's hard to get numbers for this community. You hear from anywhere from 50,000 to 200,000 at different points in time, but it certainly was a critical mass of people who wanted to live as they were used to, created demand for restaurants, hotels, gyms, media, English language media, and created a demand in this new set of institutions, some of which you see here in this slide. And the transition that we're discussing, that is going from a state-owned system with no private property to a market system with private property, sort of brought enormous changes in how Russian people lived. And keeping in mind that this was mostly a top-down process, this was not, there were not masses of Russians in the streets demanding a market economy, or this was a choice by a section of the former Soviet elite to institute a new system. And I think I've chosen these three pictures as a way of illustrating how dramatic some of these changes are, even in the way people eat, for instance. The top picture is a Soviet restaurant. In Soviet times, ordinary people did not go to restaurants. They were vaguely dangerous or immoral. Only top-ranking officials went to restaurants. They were very formal, went for hours. There was usually entertainment. Then then you see the opening of McDonald's, the next picture down here, with the crowds of people anxious to get real American fast food. And there's an enduring change. The bottom picture is a picture I took in Yaroslavl in a mall in 2017. And you see American hot pizza. There were burger places. It was, if you put aside the language, you wouldn't feel like you were anywhere in America in a food court in the mall. I'm going to talk a little bit more about more of these different sectors in which there was American influence. But primarily, I'm talking in the book about new sectors of the economy. These are sectors that either didn't exist or were dramatically changed in the new system. So we have a dramatic change in the financial system. In Soviet system, money was not an important determinant of how economic activity took place. All of a sudden, you have a new system, and there was a heavy call for foreign assistance and how to do that. Russian stock exchange was basically created by a USAID program and run by an American named Fred Berliner, who's in the book. These investment banks were usually allied between powerful Russians and foreigners who had the skills that Russians did not have in order to set up investment banks. And then there are private equity funds, and they are usually also with partners. I think the one that I found the most interesting, and I hope you might as well, is Russia Partners, which was a joint venture between Paine-Webber and the Russian Orthodox Church. And one of their early projects was to create Russian MTV, which they exited from very profitably. We look at the real estate industry. There was no private property in real estate. So there were Russians who knew how to build things, but they did not know how to lease, how to do private development. And so they called heavily on American skills in order to give them the technical means to do this. At the same time, there were a number of young Americans who played the role of brokers in matching foreigners looking for either office space or apartments with Russians that they knew. Now, so the top picture is actually one of these early commercial real estate ventures that run out of Boston. The second picture here is Pokrovsky Hills, which was one of the first big townhouse developments. And it was the entry of Heinz, a major international developer, into Russia in partnership with the American school to build these townhouses, which were an enclave of foreigners. And the bottom is just an illustration of the change in Russia. This is the same mall in Yaroslavl in 2017. Again, these skills were assimilated by Russians and then put to use to the point where they no longer needed the foreign assistance. The same here is with hotels and restaurants. The top one here is a picture of the Radisson Slavyanskaya, which was the first post-Soviet JV and business center. It was famous as a meeting ground. The lobby was once described to me by, I think accurately, as similar to the bar scene in Star Wars, with all kinds of crazy characters with making deals in the lobby. The second one here is Starlight Diner, which was also an institution, which was actually a diner that was shipped from the United States by a group of American entrepreneurs and became an institution in Moscow. And then the bottom is kind of another assimilation story, where this is Rosteik's is a Russian fried chicken that mimics Kentucky Fried and became very popular and successful. We'll move on here to some of the cultural impact. I think the one that kind of struck me a lot was Cosmopolitan. This is the first cover of the first issue of Cosmopolitan in Russia. It was a joint venture between the founders of Moscow Times, Derek and Ellen Sauer, and Hearst. And the Sauers initiated it because Moscow Times, which was the much well-known institution, wasn't making any money, and they couldn't survive. So they looked around at what was going on in Russia, and at that time, the only two women's magazines available were Farm Women and Factory Women. These were the two magazines that were available. So they brought in Cosmopolitan, and in 1994, and soon they were publishing editions with 800 pages long, with 600 pages of ads. And it became the Bible of a young generation of Russian women in a lot of ways. The picture at the top was with an advertising billboard, which was one of the first ones. It says, stop, take stress tabs. So this is to keep this guy from jumping off the edge. This created such a commotion around the Russian White House, which you can see kind of in the background, that they were forced to take it down. It was stopping traffic in the area. And then below it is Radio Maximum, which was started by Peter Gerwey, who had been involved with the space bridges and citizen diplomacy. This was the first Russian FM station. It started broadcasting on December 25th, 1991, the very day that Gorbachev abdicated power. It was purely a music station, and they were planning to play Beatles all day long. The first song they played was All You Need Is Love, and they were forced to at least read an announcement at the beginning of the hour that suddenly everything had changed in the Soviet Union. But they became a very successful model for radio in Russia. So I'm kind of coming close to the end of my time, and I want to reserve some time for some comments from Blair and from those of you who are listening. And I hope that I haven't jumped through too many different topics, but if you feel that I have, please read the book. I think you're going to find a lot of interesting stories which support some of the general statements that I've made here in the presentation. But I want to leave you with some of the things that I took away from both my own experience, but in talking to and conducting these interviews. And that, first of all, a consistent misinterpretation between Americans and Russians as to what even the situation was. And with our conception, I would say, summarized by Zygmunt Brzezinski in Foreign Policy, when he said Russia was in virtual receivership to the West, And meanwhile, I don't think the Russians never thought of themselves in receivership. They were trying to modernize their own society, and following a pattern that is prevalent in Russian history, starting with Peter the Great, which is modernization by importing foreign expertise. I also think it's important to understand that there were lasting structural changes in Russian life from this period, that while politically all is lost, there are the ways in which people live are still influenced by what happened in that time. They have not gone back to central planning. They have their own conception of what a market economy is, but still it is not a return to the Soviet Union. We don't have time to discuss this, but I think it's very clear that the FSB was, which was disbanded by Yeltsin in the first part of his period in office, and then reconstituted, that the FSB has become the core institution, or the intelligence services generally, replacing the Communist Party for reasons that probably require a lot more study. The other things, a couple things more, is that we Westerners often were deceived by talking to people who agree with us. That there was the intelligentsia who spoke English, were concentrated in the major cities, had a certain view of Russia's future that wasn't necessarily shared by people in the provinces, and who didn't speak English and who didn't talk to us. And I think it's a lesson that is important to keep in mind. And lastly, there's consistent underestimating of Russia and its importance in the world. You see the Atlantic there, the cover of 1998, Russia is finished. The whole notion of Russia being only a regional power, it's not important, all these things are shown to be incorrect. And I would say it emphasizes the importance of continuing to study Russia beyond the great man theory of history, but look at the deeper cultural and political and social patterns that go on in Russia. And I think the continuing work of institutions like the Kennan Institute is critical. So with that, I'm going to call a halt. I'm going to ask you to read the book, and I hope you will. And I'm happy to respond to any of your questions or your comments. Thank you.
I've unmuted. Thank you very much, Daniel. We're next going to turn to Blair Rubel. Blair Rubel needs no introduction. He was the former director of the Kennan Institute and is a distinguished fellow at the Wilson Center. So, Blair, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Will, and thank you, Dan. I think we're all in Dan's debt for his thoughtful and careful review of the engagement of U.S. business folks, scholars, and specialists in Russia's post-Soviet transition to a market economy. And I want to just emphasize something that Dan closed on. I first met Dan in Yaroslav, and I think one contribution which he makes in the book, and he made through his work, is that the post-Soviet transition looked very different outside of Moscow and St. Petersburg than it did within Moscow with all of those expats hanging around. And I think, and considering how it is, our analysis ended up missing so much. A big part of it has to do with people not doing what Dan did, which was really getting out and finding shopping malls in provincial Russian cities that are out of the way. So I also want to underscore that part of Dan's work. I think, unsurprisingly, for a subject as politically charged as this one, the role of American and even Western advisors and specialists in the Russian transition, This is a subject that's highly contested and often reduced more to sloganeering than analysis. This is even more the case when we look at a Russia today that's very different from the Russia that people Dan writes about thought that they were helping to create. Yet the record, and Dan shows this very well, is much more variegated than any slogan. And this is perhaps the greatest contribution of the book, and why anybody interested in the past half century of US-Russian relations should have a look. There are several variables which produce contradictory results, as Dan shows. Different areas of intended reform produce different outcomes. On a positive side, in the book, it becomes clear that the reform of the Russian legal community moved along quite quickly. Americans who went over to set up law firms in Russia very quickly moved from bringing in expat lawyers to hiring and managing teams of highly qualified Russian lawyers. This was an assimilation story that in a way is a model. Perhaps more negatively, efforts to undermine the older Soviet state-driven economy fell far short of the proclaimed goals, as those institutions and the people within them created often pernicious outcomes, which were neither the Soviet institutions of old, and this is another important point that Dan's work underscores. We're not talking about a return, we're talking about something new, but something that doesn't resemble North American and European practices. Perhaps the Japanese zaibatsu or Korean chaibols are closer to where we ended up. Another factor that made a difference was the background of the Western specialists involved. Those who had previously engaged with Russian society, culture, institutions, and language came closer to nurturing the conditions for lasting reform than academic specialists who parachuted in and for whom Russia was just one more case to prove a theory they already believed in. And I recall meeting a senior economist who was holding forth on the need for Russia to rapidly become a market economy. And when he was asked what surprised him when he first went to Russia, he responded that he often felt like a surgeon operating on a Martian. He cut the Martian open, and all the organs were there, but they weren't where they were in humans. So then he was asked, what did you do? He said, I went ahead and operated. And I think that story helps to explain a lot of the perversions of what a market might be that emerged. Or, as Russian humorist Vladimir Voinovich once declared, Russia has become fully capitalist, the capitalism we read about in Prague. Russian interlocutors, and this is part of the reason why you get that outcome and is a real strength of Dan's work, Russian interlocutors were hardly passive, and they remained agents who shaped their own fates. Russians and Americans engaged in common activities with different objectives, and all too often misinterpreted each other's intentions. And I think the interviews and the book really illustrate. And they also illustrate how Russians very quickly learned how to play Russian advisors for advantage in their own internecine struggles. And it provides a strong counterweight for the notion that basically Westerns were simply imposing a system on Russia. I think there'll be long discussions about what this period means. Is it merely another cycle of partial Russian modernization that we've been through, or is it something else? But I think Dan's stories and analysis really adds another important piece to the conversation that has to take place. And this gets to my final point. He's looked at a complex story that is often given to oversimplification. And I hope that the complex lessons he draws out will begin to help us to reconsider the future of US-Russian relations, which have ended up in a very different place than the people he wrote about in the 80s and 90s expected. But it provides a starting point for thinking about how we should move forward in the future. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Blair. For our audience online, if you want to submit any questions, please submit them via the Q&A function, and we'll get to them as fast as possible. I think I want to follow up on Blair's last point in terms of he talked about what needed to be done or what should be done maybe today in order to try to understand Russia, or try to what would you try to do in order to break through the current divides, as it were, the isolation from Russia. It was intended that if Russia integrated into the global economy, it would be a source of change and transformation in Russia. So I guess my first question is, what, in light of where things went, what would you kind of do today? I know that's not the subject of your book, but and this is a very big subject as well. What would you think today could revitalize a Russia-American relationship?
And you're asking this of
you.
All right. With the caveat that that is not what the book is about.
Yes.
I have, along with probably many of the people who were interviewed, struggled with this question myself. My answer is only a personal one, and it's only a partial answer. First of all, I don't believe that we can substantially change the situation while we're at war. I don't think we appreciate the depths of the difference in worldviews between us that in many ways seems to me even more substantial because of than in the Soviet period in the Cold War. But if and when we are able to do the breakthrough, I think we need to look back at the period of citizen diplomacy and find things on the margins where there can be communication and collaboration. There are people alive, many people alive now in Russia who remember those years and who have fond memories of having friends in America or positive experiences in America. The problem is the younger generation doesn't have those things because there are no exchanges and there's no opportunity for people-to-people contact. So I think sort of looking forward, we have to look for opportunities for real people-to-people contact. And they're going to be on the margins. I mean, if you could have predicted that a conference on the study of the human aura would lead to mass exchanges between citizens of the two countries, nobody could have predicted that. And my guess is that there are things which we now don't recognize, or areas in which we have to look for ways to rebuild communications as a preliminary step. So that's the only thing I can think of at this moment, to be honest with you.
Thanks very much. We have several questions, so I'm going to try to get to them as fast as possible. But the first question is from John Blaney, who thanks you for focusing on this era. Why do you think the cautionary messages from the U.S. Embassy, Moscow, about trying to implement shock therapy were ignored? Was it pressure from Harvard, or both, or from both sides to do more business, or something else?
I think you have to look at what were the Russian side. So Anatoly Chubais, who was running the privatization agency at this time, often described himself at that period as a kamikaze. he was a suicide pilot. He and his colleagues expected that they needed to quickly privatize in any way possible. And it didn't matter who got ownership. It just mattered that there was ownership. And so if you look at Alfred Cook's book about private selling of Russia, was also involved with this same group. He talks about the coupon privatization as being a Russian idea. I think what they latched on to this shock therapy which had been conducted in Poland, and so it was something that had been implemented elsewhere, and they wanted it, and they wanted Sachs, and they wanted Harvard, and they said, "Come on, help us do this as quickly as possible." It was a Russian impulse, and it wasn't something that Harvard convinced them. Harvard just was a beneficiary of it. And then if you read the Boris Jordan's interview, he said Harvard didn't know what they were doing either, but his financial group did understand what needed to be done, and they put the program in practical form. So I'll leave it to them to fight it out. But he also says that it was all under the patronage of Chubais, that they were protected politically by Chubais. They were housed in the Metropolitan Hotel. They were young people who had access to top-level Russian leaders at a time when they shouldn't have had, given their own level of experience. But they implemented what others wanted.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Randy Bregman, and he asks, in light of the current situation, might you do a follow-up book interviewing the same or other people about what we all got wrong about Russia and possibly what we got right?
Thanks, Randy. You can read Randy's views also in the book. Sure. This book only took about 4 years out of my life. I actually started thinking about it much earlier. But what I hope is that this book will be like breadcrumbs or enticement to others to look into the same phenomena. So I hope that I'm not the only one following this line of thinking, and I would like to encourage other scholars to follow up with the people like Randy and others. Originally, the book was supposed to have Russian views of the period as well, but that would have made it about 900 pages if we had tried to do that. It was just impossible. So there's a lot to be done on this period, and so I would encourage other people to take it up.
Our next question comes from Adam Blanco, and he asks, thank you for documenting this era. How do you think the American cultural influence has impacted the Russian politics then and today?
Wow. Okay, Adam, a simple question. Adam, by the way, modestly didn't reveal that he was one of the original Peace Corps volunteers in Russia at the very early stages, and was an insightful observer of Russia himself. Look, the thing that I focused on in the book was there was an initial romance with American life and culture, a Russian admiration for our consumer society and how we lived, and a desire to live that way. That began to sour, and as the 90s went along, and by 1998 or 1999, Russians commonly would say things like, "Stop telling us how to live." And there was a pushback that began much earlier than I think most Americans realized or took account of, and the seriousness of it. And that there was a sense that Russia was being treated as a junior partner in the world, and a place which they could not accept, and without respect or appreciation for their own culture. And so the hubris that we had and the attitude that we had led to a counter reaction. And I would think not necessarily from the intelligentsia or people in the big cities, but in the other areas of the country and the people who represent them. So that I think is an important aspect of what transpired during the 90s. Blair, you want to add to that?
If I can just add very quickly, I think one theme that emerges in the book is the need for American humility. And throughout this story, there are times when we were in denial about Russian agency. A lot of what happened, and Dan, I think you show this, happened because of what Russians did and wanted and thought. But we thought we were the masters. And I go back to one conversation with somebody and it was the Father Bush administration, but he said, the Russians have to do this. And I said, no, they don't have to do anything. He said, oh, no, they don't have any choice. And it was that attitude that was rampant, that the Russians didn't have choices. And it turns out they had a lot of choices and not necessarily choices we would have wanted them to make.
Okay, our next question comes about let me try to, is from David Edick. And in terms of successful engagement with Russians, please characterize the quality of outcomes developed through listening versus projecting and or pontificating.
Thanks for the question. Another person who appears in the book, who I think from my interview understands the problems that were created by lecturing Russians and the failure to listen, that you know, it was sort of like, you know, there's a kind of a thing where if someone doesn't speak English, if you just yell at them louder in English, that somehow they're going to understand you. It's sort of a you know, a kind of a joke, but you just yell at them and keep yelling in English. And we sort of, there were times and instances where that same approach was going on, where there would be a problem. When I was part of the joint venture, we would have some difficulty getting an approval, for instance. So the Americans would say, well, just get it. And it didn't matter how, they just yelled at the Russian staff, never listened to why they were having trouble getting it, or asked the Russian staff, how would you get it? There was a lot of that kind of dictating, and a sense that these were backward people who just didn't know what they were doing. And that lack of respect and mutuality is really doomed us in a lot of ways.
Thanks. Our next question comes from Abby McGill. And she asks, I'd be interested to hear the speaker's thoughts on the impact of the negative side of market adaptation in Russia. The U.S. so progressively pushed privatization in ways that sidelined protections for economic rights, etc. This was attractive to corporate elites, but detrimental to the general population. Yeah,
I think this is a very painful topic. personally, I can remember being in Moscow and St. Petersburg in the early 90s, where elderly people were lining the steps of the metro, selling meager possessions, a light bulb, a single lamp, pair of socks, some small goods because they were desperate. And at the same time, we Americans were sort of striding through exuberant with the possibilities in front of us. And we, I think, often just ignored the pain that was suffered by the general population. We just didn't see it. We were the masters of the universe at that point. And those kinds of things have come back to bite us.
Our next question comes from Virginia Thompson. What do you see as the most open doors of reaching youth in the Russian Federation?
You know, the irony of that question is that in the Cold War, there was no technology for people to reach each other. You couldn't. So the space bridges were a technological breakthrough that allowed for a direct conversation between Russian and American citizens. We have all the means in the world of communication, and yet we have little. We don't communicate. So I don't know how to answer that question exactly, except that the means of communication are there. Most Russians who are technically literate know how to use a VPN, and they can access the internet, they can get news, or they can use Telegram, or they can use WhatsApp. Somehow our content of communication is lacking. And I don't have an answer to that, and I'm hoping that some of the people who are listening have a better answer than I do. But the technical means are there, but the content is just missing.
Our next question comes from Thane Gustafson, and he asks if you have any good sources, articles, books on the European experience in Russia at the same time.
Well, that's another research and book to be written. Many of the people that I interviewed said, well, my European friends are mad because you're excluding them, and it's, you know, the way that my book was constructed was a lot through networking, through people I knew who knew people. There is a way that network could be tapped to bring Europeans. I don't know of a comparable account that has done that. But having said that, that wasn't my objective. And so I was fairly narrowly focused on Americans. I did interview a couple, and actually there are some Europeans in the book. I mean, the Sauers are from Denmark. Henrik Winter, who was one of the restaurateurs, is Danish American. I interviewed a few people in the business community, but I wasn't able to use those. So it's another part of the story that needs to be told. And the interrelationship between Americans and Europeans also would be worth telling, because they weren't necessarily giving the same advice as the Americans were giving. So Russians were getting all kinds of different models and kinds of advice that they could pick and choose from, depending on who they liked and how it fit their objectives. So there's a lot left to be unpacked from that time.
Our next question comes from Joe Dressen, and he asks, how effective was the U.S. Russia Investment Fund in modeling direct investment?
Well, there's a whole section on that, and Pat Clordy, who unfortunately has passed away, gave me an interview about that, and she said that they were very successful, that they had over 50 projects, which they industrial projects that they participated in and were successful. Most of them made a profit. She saw herself as a business person, not as an ambassador of a social system, and wished there had been more people involved with private equity, that it might have made more of an impact because they were closer to the actual operations of companies than those who dealt only in shares and speculation in share ownership. So I think it was fairly significant and important.
I have one last question, Dan, and then we'll close this session. Vladimir Putin famously was in Dresden at the time of the collapse of the Soviet Union and worked in St. Petersburg with Mayor Sobchak. What was his experience? What do you think is his quintessential experience during this time? And how did that evolve over time in terms of how he viewed the economic reforms of the Yeltsin period and after?
Well, I think you're going to have to look at biographers of Putin. I don't think that I have any special insight into that, other than to say that he did change. I think he did change over time. Maybe he became more of who he was over time, maybe less disoriented by the changes. He was like many of the bureaucrats of that time, is that their whole life was disrupted and they had to find some new way of living. And they all experimented and ad-libbed by trying to find some way to benefit personally from these changed circumstances. And I think probably if you look at what he was doing in St. Petersburg, that's some version of that. As he evolved over time, he seems to have assumed some sense of a historic mission for himself, which is having already secured his personal fortune. So I don't have any other specific special insight into that, but I think it's something that his biographers will give us a better insight.
It gives us something to do going forward as well.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. Thank you very much, Blair. It's always a pleasure to welcome you back to the Kennan Institute. And I just want to do the discount code one more time for if you want to purchase Creating the Post-Soviet Russian Market Economy. The code is capital AEV V23 to get a 20% discount. So
Great.
Thank you very much, Dan, and thank you all for listening. And I look forward to having all the audience come to future Kennan Institute events.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks to the audience as well.